critical swing state of Colorado, where SUVs have replaced the buffaloes that used to roam the plains.
According to this report, Colorado voters are going the way of the buffalo. They're disappearing.
This government report says that nearly 1 in 5 voters, 19.4%, were taken off the rolls. Democrats accuse Republican Secretary of State Danetta Davidson of orchestrating the purge, but she says local officials have the final say over voter rolls.
She ended up here in Washington when George Bush appointed her head of the United States Elections Assistance Commission, where her job is to tell the rest of the nation how to run unbiased elections. She commissioned a report on election fixing. The report came in like this, but came out like this. It was written by Republican and Democratic experts.
They concluded that Republican fears of widespread voter fraud were unfounded. This is the report's author, Tova Wang.
This idea of massive in-person polling place fraud on Election Day is just an absolute myth.
The bipartisan team found Democrats were right to worry that legitimate voters were being excluded. But by the time Bush's chairwoman published the report, the experts' conclusions were turned upside down.
They left out a lot of the information that we provided regarding voter intimidation and vote suppression. They left out, edited out, the number of things that could be perceived as critical of the Department of Justice's handling of voter intimidation cases.
U.S. law permits political party workers to go right into the polling stations and challenge voters when they show up to vote. Experts fear this could lead to intimidation of legitimate voters.
Despite the election experts' views, Republicans demanded new grounds for challenge, they said, to stop Democrats cheating.
We know that, and we know their party rests on the base of electoral fraud.
The answer came from the man known as Bush's brain, Karl Rove, who demanded new ID voting laws.
I go to the grocery store and I want to cash a check to pay for my groceries. I got to show a little bit of ID. Why should it not be reasonable and responsible to say that when people show up at the voting place, they ought to be able to prove who they are by showing some form of ID?
New ID laws will hit black voters hardest, says Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., son of the late Attorney General and voting rights lawyer.
You know, Karl Rove said he goes to a grocery store, he has to show an ID to cash a check. So why can't you be required to show a photo ID when you vote for President of the United States?
That seems sensible. However, in America, it raises a racial issue.
I have an ID, and most Americans have an ID. But 1 out of every 10 Americans don't have a government-issued ID because they don't travel abroad, so they don't have passports, and they don't drive a car, so they don't have driver's licenses. The number rises to 1 in 5 when you're dealing with the African-American community.
Altogether, an estimated 100,000 black voters in just one swing state, Indiana, will lose their vote to the new law. But when I stopped by the Native American pueblos of New Mexico, I discovered that when it comes to voter suppression, Democrats don't have clean hands either. Local politicians wanted to reopen a uranium mine on the Pueblo's sacred mountain. The Pueblos were not happy.
See, that's a very secret mountain that we have. There is a place, special place that we pray for to have a nice summer, have good rain.
The officials gave the Pueblos ballots without envelopes. Then these same politicians threw out their votes because they didn't come in the right envelopes. The Democrats were charged with cheating the Pueblos by this man, David Iglesias, a rising Republican star appointed U.S. prosecutor by George Bush. But the Bush administration wanted him to go after individual Democrat voters. Republicans bombarded Iglesias with allegations of fraud by Democrats.
Over 100 complaints. We investigated for almost 2 years. I didn't find one prosecutable voter fraud case in the entire state of New Mexico.
So the Bush administration fired him.
Not prosecuting innocent people led to your removal?
Yeah, I mean, they wanted some splashy pre-election indictments that would scare these alleged hordes of illegal voters away. They're looking for improperly politicized U.S. attorneys to file bogus voter fraud cases.
In the last presidential election, officially, 3 million votes were cast and never counted. This time, it could go a lot higher.
And then there's the chronic shortage of voting machines. In Ohio last time, voters in prosperous white neighborhoods waited only 15 minutes to vote, while voters in poor black areas waited in line 4 hours. It all adds up, and it can change the outcome.
If you combine people who are disenfranchised by voter ID, people who are disenfranchised by other things, such as there not being enough voting machines, combined with people who will be shut out because they have been left off the voter registration list, that's enough to swing the election.
If the final count is as close as the polls indicate, the next man in that house won't be chosen by counting the votes, but by blocking the voters.